That day started out like any other, and I never could have predicted the way it would unravel. Over the years, my stepson Caleb and I had developed a civil relationship. We weren't particularly close, but we got along just fine, enough to keep things comfortable. Now in his mid-20s, Caleb carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from being young, athletic, and sure of who you are. He always had a maturity about him that was hard to miss. I tried to keep my role as his stepdad straightforward, avoiding unnecessary complications, but being a stepparent always comes with its own set of hurdles. It all kicked off with a casual suggestion. Caleb asked if I'd like to catch a movie with him that weekend. At first it struck me as nothing out of the ordinary. Every now and then we'd hang out to maintain a sense of connection, especially since my wife, Caleb's mother, was usually wrapped up in her own world, too busy to join us. I figured it wouldn't hurt to spend a little time together, maybe even strengthen our bond, so I agreed without giving it much thought. That evening the theater was packed, but Caleb had planned ahead and booked seats right in the middle. Prime spots for enjoying the film. As we settled in, I felt a subtle tension, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the dim lighting and the closeness of the seating, but something about that night already felt off. When the movie began, I tried to focus on the story, but my attention kept drifting. Caleb seemed to be sitting a little closer than usual, and there was an odd energy in the air. His behavior struck me as different, more attentive, almost as if I had his undivided focus. Even though we weren't talking, I noticed him glancing my way more than once. Every time I caught him, he'd quickly look back at the screen, as if trying to avoid being caught in the act. The moment that shifted everything came when Caleb leaned toward me, his voice low and close to my ear. "Are you enjoying the movie?" he asked. I nodded, trying to act normal, but the sound of his voice and the warmth of his breath sent an involuntary chill down my spine. Something about the way he spoke felt far from casual. I told myself I was imagining things. This is your stepson, for God's sake. Don't read into it, I thought, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. It lingered like a shadow, heavy and persistent, stirring feelings I wasn't ready to confront. Halfway through the movie, during a quieter moment, things escalated in a way I couldn't have predicted. Caleb's hand brushed against mine. At first, I chalked it up to being accidental and tried to refocus on the film. But then it happened again. This time the touch was deliberate. He didn't pull away, and neither did I. My breath hitched as silence seemed to press in on us, heavier than the dialogue coming from the screen. Slowly, Caleb's fingers began to trace over mine, his touch light yet intentional. My heart raced as a whirlwind of emotions flooded me. Confusion, guilt, and something dangerously close to desire. Deep down, I knew this was crossing a line, but I couldn't bring myself to stop him. And then, as if my body had a mind of its own, I found myself responding. I intertwined my fingers with his, holding his hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. There we sat, in the darkness of the theater, fully aware of the boundary we were obliterating. By this point, I couldn't focus on the movie if my life depended on it. My thoughts were a tangled mess of excitement and shame. How had things come to this? What was happening between us? It wasn't something I had ever anticipated, yet I couldn't deny the intensity of the moment. The forbidden nature of it only seemed to heighten everything. Then Caleb leaned in closer, his lips barely grazing my ear. "You're beautiful," he murmured. His voice carried a quiet intensity, and I could feel the words hit me like a jolt. A shiver ran through me, and my body reacted before my mind could stop it. My pulse quickened, my face flushed, and I couldn't seem to steady my breathing. I knew I should pull away, end it before things spiraled further, but I didn't. Instead, I turned slightly toward him, our faces so close I could feel his breath against my skin. My brain screamed at me to stop, but my body had already made its choice. And then it happened. Caleb's lips met mine in a hesitant kiss, as if testing the waters. When I didn't resist, the kiss deepened. There was an urgency in the way his lips moved against mine, a hunger that had clearly been simmering beneath the surface for far longer than I'd realized. Before I even knew what I was doing, my hand reached out, gripping his arm as the kiss became more intense. In that fleeting moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. It was just the two of us, consumed by a passion neither of us had expected or prepared for. The movie, the theater, even the world outside, none of it seemed to matter anymore. It was just the two of us, caught in this whirlwind of passion that neither of us had anticipated. When our lips finally parted, both of us were left breathless, our hearts pounding in unison. I stared at Caleb, my mind reeling. What had just happened? What had we done? His eyes met mine, dark and smoldering with desire. Then in a voice barely above a whisper he said, "I've wanted to do that for so long." His confession hit me like a freight train. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment action for him. He'd been thinking about it, longing for it. And as much as I wanted to deny it, there was a part of me that had wanted it too. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the gravity of what had just happened pressing down on both of us. My thoughts were a chaotic mess. Guilt, confusion, fear, and disturbingly excitement. But underneath all of that was a desire so strong, so undeniable, that it terrified me. The rest of the movie passed by in a blur. Neither of us said a word, but the air between us was electric, practically humming with unspoken tension. When the credits finally rolled, we stayed seated, neither of us ready to face reality just yet. It felt like time had stopped, leaving us suspended in a fragile bubble of uncertainty. As we made our way out of the theater, the weight of Caleb's presence beside me was almost overwhelming. Each step felt deliberate, heavy with the unspoken. Then, without warning, I felt his hand brush against mine. This time I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let him take my hand fully in his. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me, igniting something deep inside that I couldn't name. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental. A silent promise, an acknowledgement of something unspoken yet undeniable. The drive home was quiet, almost eerily so. The low hum of the engine filled the silence, but it did nothing to ease the tension. The air between us was thick, weighted with all the things we weren't saying. I wanted to speak, to make sense of what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. Somehow I knew Caleb felt the same. Whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, we both understood it couldn't be rushed. When we finally pulled into my driveway, Caleb hesitated as he reached for the door handle. He turned to me, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that left me frozen. There was a depth in his gaze, a longing that mirrored my own. For a moment I thought he might kiss me again. But instead he smiled. It wasn't a shy or uncertain smile. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with meaning. That smile sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew it wasn't just in my head. It was a smile that said everything he wasn't saying out loud. "Good night," he murmured, his voice low and intimate, like a secret meant only for me. Without waiting for a response, he stepped inside, leaving me standing on the doorstep, my heart hammering in my chest. As the door clicked shut, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of anything. If anything, it was only the beginning. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind refused to quiet. Every moment from the theater replayed in my head. The kiss, the heat of his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. I couldn't escape the vivid memories, and with each replay, my emotions became more tangled. I knew what had happened was wrong. On so many levels it was wrong. We had crossed lines that should never have been crossed. And yet I couldn't deny the truth. Something fundamental had changed between us. The space we once shared, simple and unremarkable, had been altered beyond recognition. There was no going back. In the days that followed, Caleb and I tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. It was a careful act, a performance we both played with practiced ease. We smiled at each other the same way, spoke in the same casual tones, and pretended that everything was normal. But beneath the surface, the tension simmered, constant and unrelenting. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands, every shared silence. It all carried the weight of that night. The air between us seemed to crackle with unspoken words and unresolved emotions, a reminder of the boundary we had crossed, and the unknown territory we now found ourselves in. And then one evening it all came to a head. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the quiet house. Caleb's mother was out of town, leaving the place unusually still, the silence almost deafening. It was the kind of calm that felt like the calm before a storm. I was sitting alone in the living room, lost in my thoughts, when I heard Caleb's footsteps approaching. I didn't look up, but I could feel the shift in the air, the same pull that had lingered between us for days. He entered the room with that same intensity in his eyes, the kind that felt like it could see right through me. It was clear he'd been wrestling with something, just as I had, but now it seemed he'd made up his mind. Without saying a word, he crossed the room and sat beside me on the couch. Too close. Close enough that his body brushed against mine, setting off a storm inside me that I couldn't control. His hand, warm and steady, rested lightly on my leg. That small, deliberate touch sent a spark through me that I couldn't ignore. My breath hitched, and my heart pounded so loudly that I was sure he could hear it. For a fleeting moment I hesitated. A voice in the back of my mind whispered, "You can stop this. You can tell him to leave. You can make it all go away." But as I turned to meet his gaze, those thoughts slipped further and further away. The look in his eyes was magnetic, a mixture of vulnerability and desire that mirrored everything I'd been trying so hard to bury. The same longing I'd felt that night came rushing back, stronger than ever, and any chance of stopping him faded into nothingness. He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. When he whispered, "I want you," the words weren't just a confession. They were a spark, igniting something deep within me that I couldn't deny. Time seemed to stop. Everything else, the doubts, the guilt, the consequences, faded into the background. All that existed was the two of us and the undeniable pull between us. My resolve shattered, crumbling into pieces that I had no interest in picking up. What happened next was a blur, a whirlwind of emotion and need. His lips found mine with a hunger that felt like it had been building for years, and I kissed him back with the same intensity. Our hands roamed, tracing paths that had been forbidden until now. But in that moment, nothing felt off-limits. The world outside the room didn't exist anymore. It was just us, tangled limbs, urgent kisses, whispered words. His touch sent fire coursing through me, igniting every nerve, every part of me that had been dormant for far too long. For the first time in years I felt alive. Each kiss, each movement was laced with unspoken truths. The boundaries we'd crossed, the lines we'd shattered. It was all wrong, yet it felt so impossibly right in that fleeting moment. The weight of everything, the guilt, the consequences was still there, but it was drowned out by the intensity of what we were sharing. When the storm finally settled, and the world came back into focus, we lay there in silence. His arm was draped over me, his body warm against mine. The room was still, but the air between us was charged with the knowledge of what had just happened. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The truth hung between us, heavy and undeniable. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. There was no pretending, no going back to what we'd been before. As I stared at the ceiling, my heart still racing, the weight of what we'd done settled over me. What would happen now? Could we ever return to some semblance of normalcy? Or had we set something in motion that couldn't be stopped? The question swirled in my mind, relentless and unforgiving. Part of me wanted to believe that we could find a way to move forward, to navigate this new and dangerous territory. But deep down I knew the truth. Life as we'd known it was over. Everything had changed and there was no turning back. That one moment, that one choice had forever altered the course of our lives. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, to pretend that it hadn't happened, I knew I couldn't. Because now the weight of what we'd become was something we would both have to carry, together or apart.